Welcome to Libeth. Before the 10-foot hut can make sense, we need to understand the civilization that produced it and the civilization that was collapsing around it. Hojoki was written during one of the great transitions in Japanese history, the end of the Heian aristocratic world and the rise of warrior government under the Kamakura shogunate. Chōmei lived through civil war, political fragmentation, institutional decline, and repeated natural disasters. The elegant court culture associated with classical Japan still existed, but increasingly as appearance rather than power. The old structures remained visible, while their authority hollowed out underneath them. The Hojoki is what that instability felt like from inside the system. To understand why someone builds a 10-foot hut and calls it freedom, you need to understand what the world outside the hut was doing. And what the world outside the hut was doing, in Kamo no Chomei's lifetime, was coming apart at the foundations, not suddenly, not cleanly, but in the way that systems come apart when the gap between the formal structure of power and the actual location of power becomes too wide to maintain. The Hojoki is a personal document, but it is not separable from the political and social collapse that produced it. Chomei's withdrawal is only legible against the background of what he was withdrawing from. And what he was withdrawing from was a civilization in the process of discovering that the forms it had used to organize itself for centuries no longer corresponded to the reality they claimed to describe. The political structure of late Heian Japan was built on a formal fiction that had become increasingly difficult to sustain. The emperor sat at the center of a court system in Kyoto that operated through ranked ministries, elaborate ceremonial protocols, and a hierarchy of officials whose positions were theoretically derived from imperial authority. The Ritsuryo system, the Chinese-derived legal and administrative framework adopted centuries earlier, provided the formal architecture. But within that architecture, real power had long since migrated. The Fujiwara clan had dominated the court through the regency system for generations, placing their daughters as imperial consorts, governing in the name of emperors who were often children, constructing a parallel network of influence that used the imperial apparatus without being constrained by it. By Chomei's time, even the Fujiwara dominance was eroding, because the force that was actually reshaping Japan was coming from outside the court system entirely. The warrior clans, the Bushi, had been accumulating power in the provinces for generations, serving as enforcers for the estates that the court aristocracy owned, but could not effectively administer at a distance. The Shun system, through which private estates were held by noble families and religious institutions outside the reach of central taxation, had effectively fragmented the economic geography of Japan. The court in Kyoto depended on tribute from provinces it no longer directly controlled. The warriors who managed those provinces controlled the actual flow of resources, and when it came to it, the actual application of force. When the tension between the court factions became violent in the 1150s, and then catastrophically violent in the Genpei War of 1180 to 1185, what was being decided was not merely which aristocratic faction would dominate, but whether the aristocratic world's claim to govern Japan had any remaining substance at all. The Genpei War is the defining event of Chomei's formative years. The Taira and Minamoto clans, both warrior families with aristocratic connections, fought a war that effectively ended the Heian world. The Taira had risen to unusual prominence within the court structure. Taira no Kiyomori had achieved positions that blurred the line between the aristocratic and warrior spheres, But the structure that elevated them was the same structure that could not protect them. The Minamoto victory in 1185, at the naval battle of Dan-no-Ura, where the child emperor and the Taira leadership were destroyed, was not just a military outcome. It was the visible proof that the formal power structure and the actual power structure had separated so far that the collision between them was annihilating. Minamoto no Yoritomo established the Kamakura shogunate, a military government in eastern Japan, and Japan thereafter operated with two parallel centers of authority: the emperor and court in Kyoto retaining cultural and ceremonial legitimacy, the shogun governing from Kamakura with military and administrative reality. This was not a stable arrangement. It was a managed tension, and everyone who lived within it understood at some level that it was managed. Chomei experienced this not as political history, but as the specific texture of his daily life. His family, the Kamo clan, were hereditary shrine priests at the Kamo shrine, which was not a peripheral institution. The Kamo shrine was one of the most important religious sites in Kyoto, associated with the protection of the capital, and the hereditary positions within it were a form of social capital that should have provided Chomei with both status and income. Should have. The blocking of his succession, a court official's intervention denying him the position that birth and tradition had prepared for him, was not an isolated act of personal malice. It was the ordinary operation of a factional system in which formal rules of inheritance could be overridden by those with sufficient proximity to the real levers of influence. The Ritsurio system said the position should pass. The actual political machinery said otherwise. Chomei learned, at the most personal possible level, that the formal structure and the actual structure were not the same thing. This experience sits at the center of the Hojoki, without ever being dwelt upon at length. Chomei mentions it, releases it, and moves on, but the release is performed, not accidental. The entire architecture of the text, its movement from the public world toward progressive smallness, and eventually the 10-foot hut, is organized by the knowledge that the systems through which a person might expect to claim a place in the world, clan membership, hereditary position, artistic talent, social rank, were not reliable. They could be interrupted. They could fail. And if they could fail, then any life built on the assumption that they would hold was a life built on a misreading of the situation. The social structure Chomei inhabited was organized around a hierarchy that was becoming increasingly difficult to enforce. The high aristocracy, the inner Fujiwara circle, and those immediately adjacent to imperial power retained cultural prestige even as their political and military relevance declined. Below them, the mid-rank court officials and shrine families like the Kamo clan occupied a position that was perhaps the most exposed in the entire system. Too elevated to fall outside the system's claims on them, too peripheral to benefit from its protections, dependent on formal rules that the actual power structure could ignore whenever it suited the powerful to do so. The warriors were rising with a speed and decisiveness that made the court's claim to govern look increasingly ceremonial. And below all of this, in the streets of Kyoto, were the people whose fates Chomei documents with the most unsentimental precision. The commoners and displaced persons who died in the famines and fires and earthquakes, who had no formal position to protect them, and discovered that having no formal position at least meant there was no formal position left to lose. The famine of 1181 and 1182 is the clearest index of the system's fragility. The drought that preceded it was a natural event. The scale of the death was not. The court in Kyoto was dependent on tribute from provinces that were simultaneously a war zone. The Genpei War was consuming the east while the capital starved. The administrative machinery that should have organized food distribution could not function because the political structure that should have given it authority was itself fractured. The estates that might have provided relief were controlled by a patchwork of noble families, temples, and warrior lords, none of whom had either the incentive or the mechanism to coordinate a response. Chomei counted bodies in the streets. He records specific numbers, tens of thousands dead in a matter of months in a limited area. He notes the specific details. An old man and a young child found dead together, the man's body used as a pillow. These are not rhetorical figures. They are documentation of what happens when a social system's claim to organize and protect the people living within it collides with a crisis it was not designed to handle, and the system fails. The Buddhism that Chomei eventually turned toward was not an escape from the political world. It was one of the few institutions that had maintained a degree of coherence across the political transition. The great temples and monasteries of Kyoto and Nara were significant economic and political actors. The Kamo shrine was itself part of this religious institutional world, and the Buddhist clergy offered something the court system had stopped providing: a framework for understanding why things were as they were, and a path through that understanding that did not depend on the court's continued functioning. Chomei took his vows around 1204, by which point the Kamakura shogunate had been governing for nearly 2 decades. He was not fleeing into Buddhism from a stable world. He was finding in it a framework that the collapsing world around him had already proved inadequate to provide. The capital itself, Kyoto, is the social character that runs through the entire text. Chomei describes it not as background, but as a protagonist, one that is beautiful and repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. The brief attempt to relocate the capital in 1180, during the chaos of the early Genpei War, is one of the most striking passages in the book. The government's decision to move, the chaos of abandonment, half-built houses, the old capital suddenly half dismantled and the new one barely begun. And then the reversal, the return, the city rebuilt on its old foundations while the political order that had built it continued to transform beyond recognition. The capital move is a perfect image of the political situation. The formal authorities attempting to assert control over the situation, producing chaos instead, and then retreating to a prior form that no longer corresponded to the actual conditions. The city that Chomei eventually left for the mountain had been through 5 major catastrophes in his adult life. It had survived each one and been rebuilt each time. But each rebuilding was on shakier ground, and Chomei understood that the shaking was not incidental. It was structural. The community structures that organized Heian's social life, the court, the clan, the shrine, the network of poetic and aesthetic exchange, had provided, in their intact form, both a social identity and a practical support system. To be well-positioned within those structures was to have access to income, status, protection, and meaning. Chomei had been positioned within them, had expected to remain within them, and had been excluded from them by the same factional machinery that was slowly dismantling them from within. His movement toward the hut was therefore not a retreat from a world that was working. It was a deliberate exit from a world that had already ceased to function as advertised, performed by someone who had the clarity to recognize that the dysfunction was not temporary, and the analytical honesty to refuse to pretend otherwise. What he built on Mount Hino was the minimum. 10 feet square, portable, furnished with a musical instrument and a collection of poetry and Buddhist images. A community of one. Outside the capital, inside the landscape, in a space small enough that no one could take it from him, because there was nothing large enough to be worth taking. The Hojoki is partly a record of how a person arrives at that point. But to understand the arrival, you have to understand the world that made it feel, eventually, not like loss, but like relief. The social world behind the Hojoki explains why the book never feels like simple escapism. Chōmei did not retreat from a stable society into private fantasy. He withdrew from a political and social order that had already revealed its inability to protect the people living inside it. His blocked inheritance, the famine deaths he witnessed, the collapse of Kyoto's physical and administrative stability, all of these experiences transformed withdrawal from eccentricity into philosophical necessity. The hut becomes intelligible only against the background of a civilization losing confidence in its own permanence. And that is why the text still feels contemporary. It was written at the moment when institutions stopped appearing eternal and began revealing their fragility. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.